One of the things that brought me to studying the redevelopment of the Shaw U Street area and corridor is its history within Black America. Prior to studying that neighborhood, I studied Harlem in New York City and Bronzeville on the south side of Chicago, and some have argued that those are the two most historic African American communities in our country. But when you look at the history of Shaw and U Street, particularly its ties to Howard University, which is just on sort of the northern boundary of the community, you see that many of the faculty that were there, such as Elaine Locke, who basically preached and developed the philosophy of the New Negro, which was used as the philosophy of the Harlem Renaissance. Well, he was developing his concept and theory at Howard University and talking about it in the coffee shops and the jazz places in Shaw before he moved to Harlem. So a lot of people have said sort of the Harlem Renaissance really has its originations, and some of its philosophy is based on scholars that were in Shaw. African Americans, because of restricted covenances, were sort of segregated, and so you had a diverse sort of income population that were all African American in these communities, and so a tremendous amount of business activity, of scholarship, of artistic expression, the jazz musicians, the blues, all sort of came together in communities like Shaw. The boundaries of this area are 15th Street to the west, Florida Avenue to the north. North Capitol is the eastern boundary, and M Street is the southern boundary. Although it's still controversial whether this really encapsulates the Shaw neighborhood. In 1948, you had the Supreme Court rule against restricted covenances, and basically that allowed African Americans to legally move to different areas within cities or even outside of the city limits. So that's where you start to see areas like Shaw, Bronzeville, and Harlem start to decline in terms of their economic base because the black middle class moved out. At the same time, you also had public housing. This is sort of the time starting in 1949 where we have the urban renewal. We have large public housing projects being built in these communities, and that also had an effect on places like Shaw. After the assassination of Martin Luther King, U Street, 14th Street burns, and basically if there were middle class sort of left, they fled quickly thereafter, and business leaders as well, and the community up until the 1990s really didn't start to redevelop, and still some of the scars that communities like streets like 14th Street, U Street, also H Street and Northeast still have some of the scars that can date back to the riots of 1968. Marion Barry, I think, was critical in terms of some of the redevelopment that took place. The Reeves Center on 14th and U, and Missville Building, that area, 14th and B and W. I mean, that was one of the major drug trades or drug places in Washington D.C. And so when that building was put in, I think it was symbolic that the government resources were going to come to that area to stimulate redevelopment. 3 metro stops were brought into the community, and that was another sort of turning point. DC has done a tremendous job in terms of putting in policies that protect low-income people in areas that start to gentrify. Let's take the example of the south side of Chicago. We had the high-rise public housing that was there, the Robert Taylor Homes, Stateway Gardens. The city of Chicago, because of the deplorable conditions, decided to knock down all of the public housing in Bronzeville. Well, as that community revitalizes, you have a whole host of people that really aren't able to potentially take part of that revitalization because their housing has been knocked down, they have been given Section 8 vouchers, and landlords are not typically taking Section 8 vouchers within the community of Bronzeville because they know they can get a market rate tenant as the area redevelops. Well, in Shaw, most of the subsidized housing is not the typical high-rise public housing. It's actually place-based Section 8, and so that sort of type of housing for whatever reason, I don't quite know all the reasons, but has been able to maintain itself a little bit better than the high-rises. Also, the management companies and the owners of these place-based Section 8 housing projects are black churches or other churches that are in the community. Some of the buildings that have been subsidized in Shaw have actually turned into these resident-owned and controlled cooperatives. That is a unique policy, that right of first refusal, the right to make an offer by the tenants is a unique policy that all cities don't have. So if we're going to try to understand how do we create these mixed income, mixed races, how do we prevent massive gentrification and displacement, Shaw might be a model for city policies that have been able to sort of slow down the redevelopment, or at least slow down the gentrification and displacement process. What we have seen is, with the development that's taking place from 2000 to 2010, is there has been an honoring of the historic past. So there is a part of black history that's being preserved, but there is also a part of black history that isn't. A history tied to low-income African Americans and their struggles within the community, and some of the black protests that took place. The challenge will be, is as the community sort of moves forward, how much of the holistic picture of urban African American life in the community over time is preserved.